So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker, Sam Smith. Come on up. We just had a wonderful Chinese meal with Sam, and he's a delightful person, and he did talk all about galls. So the interest is all new information. So anyway, Sam, very now, well, let me see. You are you work for Straw. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a project manager with Blue Conservation ScienceBio program. That stands for Students and Teachers Restoring the Watershed. Based out of Nevada Baylands, we do habitat restoration work. We bring K through 12 students out to help us plant plants, mostly in salt marsh transition zones and also along riparian areas. All across California, but particularly focused in the North Bay, or in the Sonoma counties. So that's professionally. This has nothing to do with that, honestly. This is just a passion. So forgive me, but I hope a takeaway is that anyone can be a community scientist. You don't need any kind of badge or certificate. You can go out there and make amazing discoveries if you just spend some time staring at oak trees. Sweet. All right. So first of all, what is a gall? So a gall is an abnormal growth of plant tissue. Think of it like a benign plant tumor. And something that's interesting about galls is that they can be produced by a huge variety of the kingdom of life. So it's not something that's, evolved once and then spread out, but rather all these different life forms have independently evolved this feature of forming a gall. So what are some examples? They can be induced by insects, as for example with this, this is a willow apple gall sawfly. So you'll see a lot of willow leaves have these little beads. There's a bunch of sawfly larvae in that one. They can be induced by arachnids. This is a lovely poison ivy mite gall. This one's actually on poison oak though, so it can grow on any of the sumac family plants, poison ivy, poison oak. They can grow on, they can be fungi. In this case, this is the alder tongue gall. So our alder cones can get this cool growth that's on the fresh cones like that. And so unlike these other ones where there's like larvae developing on the inside, this is more like a, think of it almost like a fruiting body of a mushroom. So this is a spore dispersal mechanism. They can also even be nematodes. And this is a fun one to know as a native plant enthusiast. This is a special nematode that grows only on our native grass, Danthonia californica. This is Cynipidae danthoniae. And so it's actually helpful if you don't have a flower or inflorescence of Danthonia californica. You can find these little beads oftentimes growing on the leaf blades. And that's the only species that hosts this nematode. So that's kind of cool. And they can even be other plants. Famous examples of that would be like a witch's rune. Like, so for example, a mistletoe can produce galls. In this case, I showed a picture of dodder, this is field dodder, which can, infect a variety of different plants, usually in like alfalfa is a common host, for example. And one thing that's kind of cool is there's actually a secondary gall here. So that orange thing you're seeing is the mistletoe, and it galls the plant host. And then those little beads are actually a weevil gall. So there's even galls on galls. So an overarching question is, what is the evolutionary benefit of forming a gall? And here are a few different ideas of it, sort of zooming back into the insect realm. So first of all, they're a nursery for young. They're a food source. So it's not only as a nursery, but it's actually like a built-in kitchen. And then a good clue for why insects tend to produce galls is that we notice that gall diversity increases in areas that are more arid, but still have the necessary plant hosts. So, for example, California and also the Southwest host a huge variety of galls, whereas places like a temperate rainforest or our eastern forests, they do not have the same diversity of galls. So one of the big things that galls do is they prevent desiccation. So in a area that's really controlled by the lack of access to moisture, galls are this really clever way to preserve moisture for insects. This talk is going to be focused on the oak gall wasps. And here's a couple pictures of different adults of the oak galls, but I'll tell you, I've never seen an adult oak gall wasp in the wild. I've reared them before, but they only are on the wing for between a day to a week at a time. So the way you'll really see them is as galls. But as adults, they're these tiny, nondescript stingless wasps. There's over 1,400 known species, and then there's definitely at least several hundred unknown and undescribed species. And one of the reasons that I think they're so fascinating is because they're absolutely ecosystem engineers, both on a small scale and then also zooming out, they really have an outsized impact in oak woodlands in general. So jumping into what is the Cynipidae life cycle? So one of the fascinating discoveries that's surprisingly recent in the study of gall wasps is that most species have 2 generations per year, and these 2 generations produce galls that look completely different from each other. So you would never be able to connect them without rearing the adults and seeing that the adults are morphologically similar, and then now we can do DNA analysis and see that they have the same DNA. So they have a unisexual, which is also called the agamic generation, and that's the generation that produces fall wasps, fall galls that are the ones that last for a while, get really big, and most people are familiar with if you're familiar with galls. And then they also produce this bisexual, or also called the sex-gen generation, which produce different galls that are more short-lived and tend to be on flowers or catkins or new growth buds. So the adults lay eggs, called it with an ovipositor, which is actually like one of the defining feature of wasps in general. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, like an ovipositor, if you think of a yellow jacket, your typical wasp, that's actually just an adapted ovipositor. So all wasps have some kind of ovipositor. They don't all have to use them to lay eggs, but that's their original function. And after the eggs are laid into this plant tissue, then the larvae secrete a hormone which induces gall formation. So here's an example of the life cycle. This is not from one of our local galls, but this is the best diagram I could see. And it does apply well to our species too. So the gall that you might be most familiar with would be what's actually an E. That's where, for example, your California oak apple gall, that really big gall that grows, that would be growing in stage E. Then as it develops, the larvae develop and eventually pupate in the early spring. And then that is the asexual generation, so it's all females. And they're able to reproduce asexually, and then they oviposit on those on a new flower or a catkin in the case of an oak, or potentially a bud. And then there's this short-lived sexual generation that produces a different kind of gall. So you'll notice in this case it's a stem gall that you can't see as the asexual generation. Then the sexual generation has these kind of little round balls that make disform the shape of the flowers. And then in mid-spring, maybe this one's in March, for example, then there's a sexual generation, both males and females emerge. And then they mate, and then that female then lays the larva, restarting the cycle. And one thing to note is, as this shows, it's often very uncommon that we encounter males. So there's really a lot of question marks about how the reproduction actually occurs, and there's just a lot of mysteries in general with their life cycle. But this general sort of life cycle applies to the majority of our oak gall wasps. There are exceptions. There's quite a few species that we don't know of any sexual generation, and we don't know whether that's because they just only have an asexual life cycle, or we just haven't discovered the sexual generation yet. So that's kind of the outstanding question. Okay, and then diving into how do the galls actually get produced? So it's broken into 3 stages. You can think of it as initiation, development, and then maturation. And forgive a little science terminology. This is not really my background either, so I have a little more text here, and I'll go slow. But it involves both meristematic and then parenchyma host tissue. So meristematic cells are the undifferentiated stem cells that are capable of continuous cell division. So in a new bud, for example, that's kind of the cells that interact with plant growth hormones to produce the whole variety of different plant organs that they grow into. So these are crucial for plant growth. And the original hypothesis was that these were all of the cells that were always targeted by adult galls to oviposit onto. It would make sense that the hormones that these release engage with these more sort of flexible, less determined cells naturally. But there's also parenchyma tissue involved. And now that's the tissue that is already differentiated, specialized. It's the functional organ tissue that makes up the majority of a developed plant. And in the initiation phase, so an adult gall, as this picture, an adult gall wasp will oviposit. They'll use that little stinger to lay an egg in the tissue of a plant. And then the larva releases this chemical compound, which then accelerates the production of plant growth hormones. And then, as I mentioned, directly sort of released into that meristematic tissue. But then some galls are induced on already differentiated parenchyma tissue. And then through a process of dedifferentialization, they turn this hormone, the larva hormone, turns those cells back into the stem cells that can then be adapted to grow into a variety of shapes. So there's a lot of interest and research into how do they actually do this. Because as you can kind of imagine, if we could do that, there'd be a lot of potentials. So I do think that one of the main avenues of research into gall wasps has to do with what's going on under the hood of all these chemical processes that are allowing them to really hijack plant systems to produce this huge variety of different shapes and structures and textures. So the next, after gall initiation happens, then we're into gall development. So in this process, that hormone is interacting with plant growth hormones to cause cells to proliferate and differentiate, forming inner and outer gall chambers. And the inner chamber ends up forming that parenchyma tissue, whether it was originally parenchyma tissue, got dedifferentialized back out of that and then back into it, or whether it was just turning the meristematic tissue into that parenchyma tissue. And then they convert that inner chamber gets converted into nutritive tissue, which is rich in lipids and proteins. At first, it's also rich in starches, but those slowly get converted into more proteins. And the larva from the inside graze this inner tissue. And so thinking of it, zooming out a little bit in terms of the ecosystem effects, if you're an animal, if you're a mouse on the ground, or if you're a bird, if you can get access to that inner gall tissue, that's like a perfect little tasty morsel of protein and lipids. So it just goes to show how you can already start seeing how these galls are making nutrients that oak trees are storing bioavailable for a huge variety of organisms. Then on the other hand, the outer gall chamber is made of cortical parenchyma tissue, which lignifies, so it kind of hardens, and that helps make that sort of less permeable outer layer, which stops desiccation. That kind of hints back at that, what I mentioned at the start of why galls are helpful adaptation. And then this tissue is often strongly tannic. And that gets at one of the other sort of classic things about galls, which is that galls are one of the best sources of tannins and one of the best dyes because of that. So they have a really long history of being used by humans to make dyes. And there's basically a lot of secondary chemicals that the galls produce to then also deter other predators and parasites. So there's a lot going on there as well. But that's all happening in the gall development phase. And then as the larva develops, then the next stage is gall maturation. And so at this stage, all of the nutritive tissue on the inside in that inner chamber has been consumed by the larva. And then the remaining tissue further lignifies. So for example, there's this muffin gall wasp over here. And you can see it's like kind of all dried out. When it was fresh, it would have been a softer, more colorful material. But then this is now desiccated and lignified. And the larvae pupate as the gall desiccates. And depending on the species, some gall species fully dry out before the larvae pupate, but some of them pupate before, vice versa is also possible. So those aren't like a one, as far as these two can flip-flop sort of. The adult wasp will then exit the gall, and you can see that little exit hole in this one. So you know that at least a species exited it. I'll get to the fact that it could have been a parasite. I can't confirm that, but yeah, and one thing to mention about this is that this is a great example of the importance of leaving leaf litter intact whenever possible, because all of our galls that are produced on deciduous trees, they often don't pupate until the leaves have actually dropped and dried and are on the ground. So a large part of the life cycle of a lot of these galls actually occurs on the ground in the wintertime. Cool. So that's sort of an overview of the sort of details of the life cycle of a gall. And then zooming back into those two different generations. So there's that agamic unisexual generation, And that's the one that goes through this process called parthenogenesis. And parthenogenesis is a very sci-fi word. It just kind of drew me in when I heard it. And it means asexual reproduction. And it's been studied widely in lizards, and which can do it. And there's a few other species. I don't think that the mechanism through which gall wasp is, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know that it's been determined fully. But basically, the fall generation of galls produces a generation of adult wasps that are all females. And they don't require any sexual reproduction to then lay an egg afterwards. Some species, like for example, our oak apple gall wasp, as I mentioned, are only known from this asexual generation. And it's not clear whether there's some missing link that we're missing, or if they just stay, they just are always asexually reproducing. And then the other generation is the bisexual generation. And this is that short-lived generation of males and females, which have these spring galls. You can see this is an example of a really small bud gall. This is of the spine turban gall wasp, which I'll show you more pictures of later. And yeah, they oftentimes emerge here from like mid-February through to like mid-April. But in the mountains, they would occur later. So they kind of, the cool thing is that the phenology of when the wasps emerge, when the previous generation of wasps emerge, is clearly very closely timed with the phenology of the plant. So when the plant is flowering, that's the best time for the gall wasp to emerge. And there's been some studies about whether, like, to what extent that's linked, like, what's the source, what links these? Is it some, like, pheromone that the plant's releasing that allows the gall wasp to emerge at the right time? Or is it more linked, like, to a time of year? Because kind of like with bird migration, how there's a concern that as plant phenology changes, maybe birds won't be able to keep up with it. Well, it seems like there's more of a chemical signaling going on, because galls are really good, gall wasps are really good at emerging at the right time, even when the timing of year that the plant flowers is variable. So like more on cycles of the moon and the stars. Yeah, this is the sex gen. I think that covers that one. Okay, so now talking a little bit about plants. You're probably tired of me here talking about insects, so back to some plants. About the oak family. And as I maybe hinted at, the Cynipidae wasps, the vast majority of the diversity of Cynipidae wasps require oaks as their hosts. I will mention briefly that as a twist of fate, roses can also host Cynipidae wasps. That's kind of the only group outside of the oak family, the greater oak family, Fagaceae, that gall wasps are on in our area. But mostly they're on oaks. So, and it's very helpful to learn oak sections in order to identify gall wasps, because it seems like a lot of gall wasps are able to switch host species within sections, but you'll never see them cross sections. So for example, you can think of a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? A whole group of, gall wasps that only live on white oaks, and you'll never find them on a coast live oak. And there's a whole group of wasps that could live on a black oak or a coast live oak, but you'll never find them on a canyon live oak, for example, because that's a separate section. So I just thought I'd briefly cover those sections. And as many people are familiar with oaks know, within sections, oaks can hybridize wildly as well. So that kind of aligns. It's kind of convenient that you don't need to be able to identify an oak to species in order to have a sense of like, oh, this is a gall wasp that's associating with a white oak. Because as I'll mention later, for example, there's some gall wasps that I mostly see only on valley oaks, but then I've also observed them on species that were clearly hybrids with valley oak and other hybridization going on. But I wouldn't find them on maybe a pure blue oak, for example. But yeah, so the white oaks, anyways. The white oaks, that's Quercus lobata, Quercus douglasii, and Quercus garryana. Those are our tree-forming white oaks in our area. Valley oak, blue oak, and Oregon oak. Then there's a whole plethora of shrub oaks as well. And I will mention that the galls certainly occur on the shrub oaks as well, but I just thought I'd focus on the trees. Distinctive things for these, all of the tree-forming species have rounded leaf lobes. So unlike the red oaks, which have bristles on the edge of their leaf lobes, they always have these rounded ones, like these Oregon oak leaves, for example. And then the most helpful thing is looking at acorns, and in particular the cupula or the acorn cap. So the acorn caps have these knobbed caps, for all of the white oaks, and that compares with the shingled caps of red oak species. So then moving on to our red oaks, that's going to be Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, Quercus whistlezeni, which is interior live oak, and then Quercus cologii, or the black oak. And here you can see those shingled caps. This is a black oak acorn that all of the red oak group has, section lobate. They also have those pointed or bristled leaf lobes. That's clearest in the black oak that has the divided leaf margin, but then even our red oaks that have entire leaf margins, like a lot of coast live oaks, they still have bristles if you look carefully at the leaves. And then the last group of oaks, which is a little more special to California and the North American Southwest in general, is the golden oaks. That's section protobolanus. And that's Quercus chrysolepis, that's the main one, canyon live oak. And there's also Quercus palmeri, which doesn't really occur in our area. The closest populations are, there's like a few outlier populations in the East Bay, and that's a very shrubby oak. And what's distinctive with these is that the leaf underside is covered in these tiny golden hairs when the leaves are young. I will say that like in the fall, a lot of times you'll find leaves that look the same color on both sides. So that's not always a guarantee identifier. But then the other piece is that the acorn cap has these thick and less pointed scales on it. And then another thing that's distinctive about canyon live oak is they have really variable leaves. So some of them are really toothed, some of them are entire. That's just kind of a distinctive thing of canyon live oak. And I mentioned that this group is sort of evolutionary more unique for North America compared to the other two, because the white oaks and the red oaks both are these large lineages that also have distribution in Asia and in Europe, and some in Africa, the white oaks in Africa as well. But then the golden oaks are only a group of like 7 or 8 species that are all in the Southwest. And they happen to have this really unique gall assemblage that's more distinctive, or also maybe less studied compared to the gall assemblages of the white oaks. And then briefly, I'll mention the oak relatives, the other members of this, which is our golden chinkapin, Crypolestis chrysophylla, and then there's also the bush chinkapin, Chrysolepis sempervirens. They also have that underside of the leaf being golden, but then they have this densely spiny fruit that contains a couple of nuts on the inside. So the fruit really separates it. They also, just like the other one I'm about to share, they have more insect pollinated flowers rather than the wind pollinated flowers of oak trees. And then there's the tan oak, and the tan oak is monospecific. It's the only member of the genus Nympholithocarpus. And yeah, it has insect pollinated flowers. It has those leathery leaves. Then the acorn caps has those distinctive spines on it. So this one you could easily mistake for being a member of the oak family, but it's actually pretty more distantly related. But these do both also host a smaller but nonetheless cool assemblage of galls, which is where I'll start. So now I'm just going to jump into showing y'all some galls. So this is the tan oak gall. There's literally only one really. There's a couple others, but this is the main one, Andrechus nympholithocarpi. And it was really recently shown by a community scientist who I'll mention a few times, Noriko Ito, that these are the same species. So it produces this little bud gall. This is really zoomed in. These are like, yay big, a couple of millimeters on buds. And then there's also this leaf gall. So if you see the swelling on the leaf there, that is a little gall wasp developing. And it wasn't known whether these are the same thing or not, but Noriko Ito, using a similar process that I'll describe later, just collected some of these leaves. And then after a few months of leaving it in the garage, the adults emerged, and then she was able to preserve them in ethanol and send them into a lab to get them described. And yeah, so this is basically the main gall that you'll see on tan oak. There's a few other species. There's a root gall and a couple other ones, but that's the one I'll highlight there. And then chinkapins have some cool galls. This one is Dryocosmus capsinopsidus. Excuse my pronunciation, there's a lot of scientific words. And it produces these flower galls, these big golden red balls. They're like these red balls that are covered in golden hairs. And sometimes if you find a flowering chinkapin, you'll see the ground is like covered in gumballs, because it can just be like by the thousands, this gall. And it's really common in chinkapin groves wherever you come across those. And I actually don't know about the life cycle of these. I'm not sure whether there's I believe that this would be the asexual generation, and I'm not sure if there's a linked bisexual generation of spring gall for this one. And there are a couple other species. There's also this leaf gall, produces these little like blisters called Giacosmus juliae. I think those are the only ones I've covered. There's one other leaf gall that also produces in a different generation a stem gall called Giacosmus riley-pokii. So there's less diversity, but there are a few of them on chinkapins as well. Now getting into the red oak galls, that's Quercus section labate. So as a reminder, that's coast live oak and interior live oak and black oak. So there's not a huge assemblage of these galls compared to the white oaks or the golden oaks. And this one, I've actually been talking to a few folks about this already, is the two-horned gall wasp, which is having a banner year, clearly. It's called the two-horned gall wasp because the asexual generation, the longer lasting generation, which is the one on the left here, I guess on your right, sorry, has two little horns. That's the name. And it in its sexual generation or the bisexual generation is in the spring, and it'll grow on really fresh new leaves or also on flowers. It produces these little red, almost like wart-looking things. And so this is the same species, but just the two different generations. And this one's kind of unique in that it produces the fall generation of wasps really late in the year, oftentimes like from late November into January or February. So when I went out looking for galls for a couple minutes today, that was like the only fresh gall I could find. Because they're actively growing in their life cycle right now. This is the pumpkin gall wasp. It's very small. This is a leaf that's like this big, so they can be like 1 or 2 millimeters. Yeah, I think they're really cute. And then there's also a couple of different kinds of stem galls. So one thing maybe I didn't mention as explicitly as I could have is that galls can be produced on really any part of plant tissue. So there's root galls, there's stem galls, there's leaf galls, there's bud galls, there's flower galls. There's galls on every part of the plant. But one thing that's kind of fun is as these are developing, it would be hard to tell these species apart because they'd just be kind of like these, like knots of wood basically. But then once the exits happen, once the galls exit, they produce different shaped exit holes. So this one is called the gouty stem gall wasp, and oftentimes it's much bigger, but I just like this one because if for any Princess Mononoke fans, it looks like a little Kadoma. It produced these little round circular exit holes. And so that's the gouty stem gall. And then this one's called the ruptured twig gall wasp. And instead of producing those circular holes, it produces these kind of longitudinally striate gall exit holes. So even though you couldn't tell them apart until the galls exit, then they're pretty distinctive. And you'll often find like huge gouty stem galls that are really large. One thing to point out, this is a good example of polyphamous galls, which is where a single gall that has multiple larvae and then produce multiple exit holes. There's also monophamous galls, which are the ones that only have a single gall larva developing in it. So that's just like a helpful differentiator for some species. So yeah, that's the gouty stem gall wasp.
Quercus business in it.
Yes, it would be. It could be on any of the red oaks. I see both of these on Quercus business. Yeah.
No, when it is on other, it's usually I just see it.
Yeah, I definitely see it on coast live oak. I think both these pictures are from coast live oak. I'm not sure that I've seen it on black oak, but I'm sure it probably could happen. In general, I don't find a lot of galls on black oak. I'm not sure why that is. But by the way, please interrupt me with questions. I forgot to mention that. Then this one is the live oak apple gall wasp. So you've probably seen that oak apple gall wasp, which is produced by valley oaks a ton. But there's also kind of an equivalent version on live oak, except for it's got a little bit of a different texture. So even without the leaves, you could probably tell it's different because it's got this almost bumpy furrowed texture. But this is the same species. So this is the fall generation of the live oak apple gall wasp. And then the spring short-lived generation on new growth, almost like a pie serving dish. So that is, I'm trying to remember Amphilobops Quercus palmiformis. I think Quercus palmiformis is like apple-shaped oak or something like that. And yeah, that's the gamete generation here on the left, and then the sex generation on the right. Let me move this up too. Okay. Then this is a cool little one that's called the kernel flower gall wasp, Caloritis sericornis. This one's pretty rare. I don't find this one very often. So that's as far as like all the other ones I've shown, you can find really pretty abundantly on our red oaks, but this one is pretty rare. I haven't seen it too many times. So that's a fun one to look for. Then moving on to the white oak galls. So that's Quercus section Quercus, and they're super diverse, they're abundant, and they're also very colorful, which I love. So here's a couple of them. This one I've already mentioned is the spined turban gall wasp, and I actually have a couple of dried ones of those to show if you want to look at afterwards. This one is really abundant on valley oak in particular. I appreciate this one because I almost only see it growing on valley oak or valley oak hybrids, very less likely to grow on Oregon oak or blue oak. So sometimes if I'm not sure on the identity of the oak species, it can be helpful if I find these galls because I'm like, oh, it's probably a valley oak then, or at least has some valley oak parentage. And then this one over here is the plate gall wasp. It's kind of flattened and looks like a plate. I also like it has this kind of sort of pattern on it that's distinctive too. And that one can grow on a variety of different white oaks. I see it mostly on blue oak though. Yeah, Farron Pattersoniae, and then Antron douglasii. And this one is the spring generation of that spine turban gall wasp, which I showed a picture of earlier as well. It's a fun one to look out for when valley oaks are budding or blooming out. They have those nice little like balloon shapes, or maybe it's like, I don't know, like a melon. And then this one is the red cone gall wasp. This is another really common and abundant one on valley oak. And this is in different stages of development. So it starts as this like little almost bullseye looking shape, and then it slowly grows into this like vase sort of gourd shaped one that usually is fully red. I occasionally see it like mottled white and red like this as well. But that's Andricus kingii, or Farron kingii, the red cone gall wasp. Here's a really little one that's kind of cute, the yellow wig gall wasp. And another thing to mention is in addition to like generally that the galls can grow on all different kinds of parts of the plant. Within the leaf, it can be helpful to note which part of the leaf it's growing on. So like, for example, this one is growing on the main, I'm having a, thank you, I appreciate it. So, and then sometimes you'll see ones that grow as extensions of outer, wow, I'm struggling with my botany terms. I've been thinking about wasps too much. Yeah, so this is Druon foliae, the yellow wig gall wasp. And yeah, it's helpful to note which part of the leaf a gall wasp is growing on as well. That can be helpful for identification. This one is called the crystalline gall wasp. And sometimes you'll see a blue oak tree that's so covered in these that it looks like it can hardly bear the weight of it. They're just so covered in these like red, spiky looking things. So when you find it, it's usually by the thousands on that tree for whatever reason. And it's mostly on blue oaks, the crystalline gall wasp. And then here, this is the convoluted gall wasp. I like whoever came up with the common names because something about it's just messy, just convoluted. And then this is one of my favorite ones, the striped volcano gall wasp. It's got a very literal name and it's very distinctive. It also has, it's also a good example, this nice macro picture is a good example of how there's these hairs on it. And with some species, there's actually like this book that I reference a lot for this and that I recommend if you want to go down the rabbit hole of learning about galls, which is Galls of the Western United States by Ronald Russo. It makes a whole key based on the hair shape. And I think for botanists, this is maybe something that's kind of relatable because I don't know if you're looking at manzanitas or even if you're looking at different oaks, sometimes you have to get a hand lens out to look at the shape of the hairs and whether they're stellate hairs or whether they're glandular hairs. And there's basically a similar thing going on with gall wasps where the shape of the hairs and the textures of the hairs can be helpful for identification. All right, so that's kind of a quick overview of the white oak galls. I will say there's so many more white oak galls that I didn't even touch on. But I think that the galls on canyon live oak are really fascinating. They're understudied. There's lots of undescribed species. And I also just find that like almost every canyon live oak I see has some cool galls on it. So whenever I see a canyon live oak, I like to stop and look for galls. Plus it has my favorite gall, which is the mushroom gall wasp. As I mentioned, I'm a mushroom fan, so it's a natural crossover. But so yeah, this is the little mushroom gall wasp. They sometimes they'll have 2 exit holes, sometimes they only have 1. I actually think It's actually interestingly, I believe, a monothalamus gall. So I think that the fact that happens, and I thought they look lovely. And this is a stem gall that just grows as this little like mushroom on top of the stem. That's Heteroechus sancticlari. Then this one is one of the most common and abundant ones, the beaked spindle gall wasp. And it's oftentimes green. It can also be pretty bright red sometimes. And then it usually has this nice like polka dotted texture on it. And that's another stem or bud gall wasp. This is a bud gall wasp rather, so it'll grow at the developing buds. Then there's this one, which is Heteroechus dactyli. I don't think this has a common name, but it actually is kind of common in Sugarloaf Ridge area, so that's a fun one to look for. There's also a much less common and undescribed relative of this one that's called the cotton candy gall wasp. I didn't include a picture because it's not really in our area, but if you see this one, keep an eye out for a really bright pink one of these, because that would be the cotton candy gall wasp, and that would be a cool find. That's an undescribed species. Then there's the Heteroechus flavans. That's like the canyon live oak gall wasp. This is a leaf gall, and yeah, it also has a nice polka dotted texture on it when it's young. So now moving on to some undescribed species. So first of all, this is actually on blue oak, but this one, when I took this picture in 2022, it did not have a name, and now it does thanks to community scientists. So I think that's pretty cool. This is the pink bow tie gall wasp. And it had been known, I think, for like 40 or 50 years, but no one had ever, I don't know whether no one had ever reared the adults or no one had ever taken the time to describe the adults, but either way, it was only published in 2023, and now we have a nice scientific name for this lovely little pink bow tie shaped gall. This one is the flange gall, Quercus douglasii. It's usually on blue oaks, and this is one version where it kind of has the star. It's like a star with a ball on top. And then there's another version that's a little more almost urchin shaped. I think these are the same one. And I see this one really abundantly, especially in like Rush Creek Preserve in Nevada. I see this on like all the blue oaks there. This is the plate gall wasp, another blue oak undescribed species. There's a couple of similar ones that look like this that are flatter, but this one kind of has some texture and then it has those little ruffled edges. And yeah, I don't think this one's described. Then this is a canyon live oak undescribed one, the bristly pear gall wasp. Looks like a bristly pear. And yeah, I don't think that, to my knowledge, this one isn't described to genus even, so they don't know which group of gall wasps forms this one, so probably hasn't been reared successfully. Then here's the hairy mushroom gall, also a canyon live oak one. And this is a good one to keep an eye out for because there's only, I think, actually, I'll show you later. I think there's only like 10 or so observations of this species on iNaturalist, but one of them is in Santa Rosa. So keep an eye out for this one. Okay, so that was a little quick guide to some of the kinds that you might see around. And then I wanted to talk about some of the sort of ecosystem aspects of galls. So first of all, one thing is talking about their parasites and inquilines. And so an inquiline you can think of as the vegetarians of the gall world. So those ones are oftentimes beetles or moths, where the adults will lay a larva that penetrates the gall, but rather than eating the developing larva, they'll eat that nutritive tissue that surrounds the larva. And then there's also a whole host of parasites and hyperparasites. So the parasites are mostly wasps, but there are some mites and insects. This is an example of a parasitic wasp that's targeting this striped volcano gall wasp. It's in the genus Dracema, but I don't know what species. And one thing that's interesting is there's a few examples of parasitic wasps that only target a specific species of gall wasp, but there's also several species of parasitic ones that can target all different varieties of gall wasps. So it's not like a one-to-one thing going on there, but there's a ton of diversity in these as well. Another thing that's interesting is that you might assume that, well, inquilines, vegetarians, they're not eating the larva itself, but there was a study that showed that I think it was something like that in this one example, it was a rose gall wasp that was looked at. When that rose gall wasp was impacted by an inquiline moth cohabitant, 80% of those galls never reared an adult. But then with that same species, looking at this chalcid parasitic wasp, actually only 20% of those gall wasps didn't develop. So it's not like this one-to-one thing where the inquilines are good news or like fine for the gall wasp and the parasites are bad. It's like just this whole tangled mess of different relationships. So you really have to just look at each interaction between the gall former and the parasite or inquiline kind of as its own thing. And then the hyperparasites are pretty crazy because there's a whole bunch of wasps that target the parasitic wasps that have already laid eggs in the gall wasps. So there's just layers upon layers of this. It's really just this endless tangle. I don't know, to me, that's just like staring at the abyss, but in like a cool way. I don't know, I can't stop looking. Another really cool example of some of the ecosystem effects with gall wasps is honeydew gall wasps. So this is a group of different wasps. In our area, oftentimes, especially on canyon live oak, or also separately a separate group that's on valley oak. I actually see them super abundantly on valley oak often that produce honeydew. And honeydew is just like sugary liquid, basically. And you'd think that there's probably some reason that these gall wasps are inducing the plant to produce this honeydew, because it's not accessible to the larva. So what's the benefit to the gall wasp to produce the honeydew? Well, it turns out that the honeydew attracts ants, and then separately, some of them attract large amounts of yellow jackets. Then those ants or yellow jackets in turn don't allow parasites to visit those galls. So there's like this, the ants are basically farming the honeydew, and in turn, they protect the gall wasp from the parasites who might be attacking them. And there's interesting dynamics between ants and wasps and the yellow jackets, that is, where ant colonies will have like a portion of the tree, and like ants and yellow jackets don't really tolerate each other, but either one will both protecting like certain parts of the tree. So if you find a valley oak in August or September that's covered in yellow jackets, it might not seem natural, but maybe look closer because there might be kind of a cool interaction going on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole host of oak woodland inhabitants that will consume gall wasps. So yeah, you can really think of galls as these nutrient sinks that make stored energy from the tree bioavailable to all these different animal species. One example that I think is cool is the sapsucker. This is a red-breasted sapsucker, and they're really winter visitors for us. But oftentimes you can find, especially those California live oak apple galls, with the characteristic telltale sapsucker holes in them. So the sapsuckers will go after the larva within those galls. So, and that's an example of one that can target the kind of woodier gall species, but then there's lots of birds that will eat the other galls as well. And if you remember that all of these galls often, for deciduous trees, they all end up in the leaf litter on the ground, then you can imagine that your California towhee, your spotted towhee, your fox sparrow, all these birds that are digging in the leaf litter looking for nutrients, they're going to eat lots of galls as well. And then in addition to that, there's lots of evidence for rodents that eat galls. You'll oftentimes find those same California oak apple galls with squirrel bites in them or chipmunk bites in them. And then a whole variety of galls have been found in wood rat nests. Other kinds of woodpeckers definitely eat galls. I know like chickadees really love willow trees that have a lot of galls. So there's just a huge variety of wildlife that's interacting with these galls as well. And then I wanted to share a little bit about some of the online resources that really make this knowledge accessible. I didn't go to school for this. I just read a bunch of books and spent some time online to learn about this stuff, and anybody really can. So one amazing website is Gall Formers, and I'll start there. Well, I'll just mention the other two first as well. Y'all are probably familiar with iNaturalist, but in case you aren't, it's this wonderful community science platform that includes this really robust map feature. So any kind of organism that you're interested in, you can see the whole range where it's been observed, and you can upload your own photos, and then other people can identify them for you. It's just this really wonderful platform, and really it's the main avenue through which I learned more. I got more excited about galls and learned more about them, because there's a whole host of people who will help you identify them, and then also are behind the scenes doing this work of helping to get gall species described. And then I also just wanted to shout out Joyce Gross, who is this person who's ran this blog and is just really passionate about galls. I think it's just a side project of hers, but she was was describing undescribed species of galls and sort of compiling pictures of them really helpfully on her website, even before iNaturalist existed. But so a cool thing about Gall Formers, it's a website totally dedicated to helping you identify galls. And one thing I love is that you can browse by host species. So if you have a valley oak and you're wondering what kind of galls might grow on it, you can go there and then look for that species. In this case, I decided to go, because I've been talking about canyon live oak, so you can go to canyon live oak, and then it lists all the known gall species, and then including, it has these what are called gall formers codes for all the undescribed species. And these are these distinctive names that they make. It'll usually start with either the genus or unknown, then it'll have the family of gall wasps, the Cynipidae, then it's Q. chrysolepis for the plant, and then it'll have a descriptive name. So the one I was thinking to look at is the hairy mushroom gall that I talked about earlier. Then if you click that, it'll have a page for that. And then this page will show you the range where you might be able to find it, the host plant, the time of year. And then at the bottom of the page, there will be a link to iNaturalist, which links to this gall formers code, the unknown Cynipidae Q. chrysolepis hairy mushroom gall. And you can tag, if I see one of these, I'll tag it with that handle in the observation code, and then anyone else who's looking for it can know. Even though there's not a species name on iNaturalist to search, there's this other way to search these undescribed species. So then I'll click on that iNaturalist link, and that'll bring me to all of the observations of this species. So yeah, there's only 10 observations of the species right now, and one of them is in Santa Rosa, so I thought it was pretty cool. It's kind of all across the range of canyon live oak, but it's a good one to keep an eye out for. And the way, if you were to find an undescribed species and want to link it to gall formers, there's this thing called observation fields. And then you can choose a field and put in gall formers code, and then you can just copy paste that code from the website, put it there. And what's cool then is on both on gall formers or on iNaturalist, you can search by those gall formers codes. So I can, it's a way basically to allow myself to search for a specific undescribed species. So a species that's, it's known what it looks like, but we've never, described the species scientifically. And then I wanted to share a few tips for identifying an unknown gall. So the first thing is to ID the host plant. And if you can't ID the host plant, then just take really good pictures of it so somebody else can on iNaturalist. And then you want to take pictures of both or all surfaces of the substrate. So if, for example, if it's growing on a leaf, take pictures of both sides of the leaf. Sometimes the gall can leave a mark on the other side of the leaf, even if it's not the main side of the gall that's distinctive. And then, as I mentioned before, the hairs can be really distinctive, or the textures. And as botanists often know, a hand lens could be helpful. A macro lens also works just well if you have a little macro camera or a big macro camera. And then it is potentially helpful to dissect one if you find several. And one thing I'll mention, and I have a link to this later, but I think as botanists, rightfully, you're really careful and don't want to pick a lot of flowers. Obviously, people do, press plants and stuff like that. But there is a lot of thought that's gone into the ethics of collecting insects for scientific study. And I do think that in general, you're not really going to be making an impact on their population dynamics by collecting a few or dissecting a few. Because if it's there, it's been there, it's going to continue to be there. I will say I'll only dissect one if I see that there's quite a few of that species around. But it can be helpful because you can note if it's monothalamus or polythalamus, and then also the shape of the interior can be helpful for identification. And then if you want to collect the galls and then potentially eventually send them in for science, you want to store them in a dry place that receives seasonal temperature variation. So a garage or a shed, just somewhere that's out of the rain, but then also gets cold enough that it signals the gall to do its normal cycle. You can use a Ziploc bag. Those are easy. The main thing is just to make sure that the gall is pretty dry before it goes in the bag, because you can have the galls molding on you otherwise. And if you collect the fall generation, which are the bigger, showier galls, oftentimes, they'll take longer. So if you collect it, you want to first of all try to collect it when it's mature. So not a really small one that's still developing, because if it's connected to the plant and still growing, it's still basically siphoning off nutrients from the plant. But not one that shows any sign of emergence or too much of the lignification going on already. Then the spring generation, if you come across them, they emerge pretty quickly. So that can be a kind of a faster process. And one thing to note is that parasites are really common. So if possible, you want to collect several species of the same kind and then bag them separately, because you can be unsure what came from what otherwise. And then just as I mentioned here, a couple other resources to share. So yeah, gall formers is awesome. iNaturalist is amazing. In particular, there's this project called the Galls of California, where you can see the whole range of galls and you can add to that. And then there's also this awesome event called Gall Week that happens twice a year. There's a spring birds to get together and look for galls. And there's pretty cool shirts. I actually meant to wear my Gall Week shirt, but I forgot. So you can order those too. This book, which I mentioned, I also meant to bring it, but forgot, but it's a wonderful resource. It has really beautiful pictures, and this guy just like dedicated so much of his life to this topic, and he named a lot of those names that you see in the gall formers codes are from this book. So this book is a really great resource. And then there's a cool podcast episode that talks about the this Independence of Plants podcast that talks about some of the evolutionary reasons for gall development, if that's something that you're interested in. And then there was this cool study that was seeking to just receive galls that you collect. The Cynipidae and Associates larval sequencing pilot study. I sent in a couple galls to that. Other people have done it. And I don't know for sure if it's still accepting it. I have to double check. I didn't get out and collect any this fall, sadly. That was a couple years ago. But it's out of the University of Iowa. It's a really cool lab. And they've already published some of their results. So there probably are. Basically, if you, especially with undescribed species, but almost no matter what, if you collect a gall and end up with an adult, there's somebody out there who wants it. And if you're willing to spend the money to ship it to them, they will happily study it for you. And you can learn more about it. And then, yeah, I just wanted to reference this person who I mentioned, Noriko Ito, who is just a community scientist like me and just became super passionate about this relatively recently. She has a great, more in-depth journal post about how to collect galls. And she has done a ton of amazing, basically the results of her collecting these galls and rearing them has already produced this whole body of cool science. And then, as I mentioned, as far as if you're wondering about the ethics of collecting galls and just in general, thinking about the ethics of collecting insects, there's this cool resource that's called the Insect Collector's Code that really breaks down when is it ethical, how to make sure we're not having a negative impact on these species. And then, yeah, I just wanted to specifically shout out some of the people that I've learned from. Noriko Ito, as I mentioned, Adam Krantz, who's the person who found gall formers. Everyone else is involved with that as well. A few other people who've been super helpful on iNaturalist for me. And then it's just cool that there's this web of nerds who are excited to share their knowledge and curiosity about these cool organisms. And then I got some sources and photo credits, but thanks, y'all. Sharing my screen now.
If there's any questions, you think you can type them into the microphone, please.
Will you speak just a little bit more about what the effect is on the plants themselves that are the hosts for all of these creatures?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a question mark overall, and it's probably variable by different species. I don't know of any example of a plant being killed by these galls. If you think about it, sort of the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid, where a parasite is something that feeds off of something but doesn't kill its host. These galls have evolved in tandem with these species, and they really don't have an incentive to kill their host. So I think in that sense, it makes sense to me intuitively that they wouldn't have an overwhelmingly negative effect. And then I think I've just from, for example, that book, Plant Galls of the Western United States, he just says basically there's no research that shows that these organisms are having a deleterious effect on oaks, for example. There's probably some exceptions. The other thing to mention is the oak gall wasps are just one of a whole host of different gall formers on all these different species. And for example, there's definitely fungal galls, for example, that have negative impact on plant populations. But even then, I think if you zoom out a little bit, there's this ecosystem effect going on that sometimes can be a positive thing, right? Of just the checks and balances on different species. But in the case of oak galls, I don't necessarily have a specific thing to point to, but I can just say that I haven't seen any research to suggest that there's examples of species that are negatively impacting their oak host. Yeah.
That's it.
So thank you. So when you collect galls, can you usually plan on their hatching out wasps? Should you put them in a
jar with a screen lid or something and be prepared for more life, or are they usually, do you usually not expect that to happen or what?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not like 100%. I think the big thing is you expect usually something's gonna emerge as long as you store it at a place that receives the seasonal temperature fluctuation, and that it doesn't get too wet where it's gonna get molded and die from that. I think the two exceptions are if you pick a wasp, if you pick a gall that is not developed enough and is still relying on the host plant to receive more nutrients, then it's probably not gonna produce an adult. But if you pick a bunch of, maybe a good example is that a cool thing that Norica did and recommend other people do is after spring storms, looking for spring galls, she just collected a bunch of stems, of fresh stems that didn't show any sign of damage or anything and put them in bags. And she ended up finding a ton of gall wasps that came out. That were just cryptic gall wasps that were living in the stems and then ended up making exit holes. So it definitely, if you collect several, you're going to end up with something. I'm not going to say it's like a 1-to-1, but in a small sample size of what I've collected, oftentimes you'll rear adults.
Well, I wanted to talk again about the two-horned gall wasp.
Yes.
Which
Lovely
is
species.
infecting my agrifolia. And you said that you felt that it wasn't causing all the leaves to drop. But in fact, I'm having just a huge leaf drop. And I blame the two-horned gall wasp.
So I can't rule out the possibility, but
Oh, thank
I would be quite surprised if that was causing a leaf drop, because the two-horned gall wasp doesn't want the leaf to drop off the tree. That's not an example of one that typically pupates or exits in the leaf litter, because coast live oak leaves stay on the tree. They're not deciduous, they're evergreen, and so I don't think that's a part of the life cycle. I don't think it's even if you find a bunch of leaves on the ground that have two-horned gall wasps, I'm pretty sure there's something else going on. Again, I don't want to say it's sudden oak death. I haven't seen the tree. But that's one possibility. The other thing is there's also the tent caterpillar moths that cause oak defoliation in mass. They could be having a big year. There's lots of other things
What is having a good year?
I don't know if it is, but the
Tell me.
oak tent caterpillar moths,
A
they can
caterpillar.
cause major defoliation of coast
So
live
it's
oaks as
a
well.
caterpillar, correct? And
Yes.
Yes, you know,
something
yeah.
that's even larger than a two-horned gall wasp. So the point is that if I really clean them up good and put them all in the compost to go out, that's not going to interrupt their life cycle at all.
That's not. There's no way you're gonna collect enough of their leaves.
So
to
they don't
interrupt their
ever
life
go
cycle.
into the soil.
Well, I mean, if they fall, they might still end up exiting, but the adults don't go into the soil. That's not part of their life cycle. Yeah, correct.
Thank you.
So keep an eye out in the spring for the spring generation of those galls, which are going to be these little purple bumps on flowers or leaves.
Oh, on the catkins?
Yep.
What are they, purple bumps?
They're these little purple bumps. I can, yeah.
So
So this is not a question, this is a comment on this. So I had the experience that you're having, Liz, of my live oaks along one of my roads. The leaves turning brown, falling off. One tree was significant leaf fall. And I took pictures of the two-horned gall wasp gall on them, but there were also on the photos this, which is like these little purple.
Yeah,
that
that looks fungal to me.
Yeah.
It could be a scale insect too. I guess.
Yeah, so I sent these over to one of the oak experts and they said, oh, you know, it's the gall is possibly causing some of the leaf drop. The good news is all of those trees did really well the next year. I actually think the leaf litter that I left below them was helpful. So yeah, anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah. So again, I'm not doubting your observation that it's causing it. I just think I wonder if there's some other infection going on with that oak tree. There could also be another kind of fungal infection, but
I was
wondering about those big oak apple galls. They go for years, right?
Is there anything happening inside them, or are they just sitting there?
Oh, so I meant to mention this specifically, but there is an example where a single oak apple gall wasp produced 30 different species of parasites, hyperparasites, inquilines, and the gall wasp itself. So there's a huge variety of life. Having said that, once you see it sitting on there, it's all blackened and there's a bunch of exit holes. It's not that likely that there's any wasp left in it. Now, that's not to say that there's not a bunch of decaying organisms living there. There's probably springtails and mites and various fungi. So it's not to say that it's not still a part of the, amazing web of life of the oak ecosystem. But once you see a bunch of exit holes on it and it's gotten darker, then it probably is no longer hosting, insect larvae.
Thing anyway, I just want to say, we have a live oak tree that every year it'll come to, it just looks like it's dying, it's losing its leaves, and then it comes back.
Yeah,
It's just what
they do that too. Yeah, they have cyclical, leaf drop.
they're genetic things. I think each oak is a separate genetic entity.
Yeah. Well, a fun example of that, there's a great study, and I don't remember who she did this talk for, but there's this person who did a research study at Pepperwood Preserve about the oaks there. And she found that one of the main genetic influences of the oaks there, of the white oaks there, was Quercus johntuckeri. And the nearest adult Quercus johntuckeri are like 600 miles away in Santa Barbara County. And yet there's this, genetic lineage still here in Sonoma County. So each oak tells its own story. Absolutely.
I have a question, also super interesting, fantastic talk, thank you. You made me wonder if, because you were talking about the fall and the spring, is there any time that you've seen a species that uses one plant species for one of those generations and then a different one?
I don't know of any Cynipidae wasps that do that. It does come, one thing that comes to mind is rust fungi, which there's certain rust fungi that have like 6 or 7 different host species at different cycles of their life cycle. So there certainly are organisms that do that. I don't know of any, and several rust fungi produce galls, so that's what made that also come to mind. I'm forgetting the species that I'm thinking of exactly. And unlike Cynipidae wasps, rust fungi tend to be less host specific, and yet so like, for example, there's a certain rust fungi that at one time of year, it'll have hosts in a certain family, like for example, Convolvaceae, and then another time of year, it'll be on conifers. And it's like the same species, and it can be on different hosts, but it'll always be for one part of its life cycle on this family, and then for another part of its life cycle on that family. So there's certainly examples of it. I don't think that there's been any oak gall wasps that have been shown to do that, but I don't know for sure.
Good question. I have one note from the Zoom that an arborist with the county of Sonoma mentions that the 2-horned gall wasp can cause partial canopy leaf drop, but they will just put out a new set of leaves.
Okay, cool.
So there is some additional information.
Cool.
Is there any other
Thank
questions?
the arborist. So there you go. I guess it is. Hopefully your tree is perfectly healthy and it's just gonna re-sprout.
Great, I'll watch.
I'll show you before and after.
Yeah.
Any further questions?